I watched them invade what was rightfully mine, documenting every transgression while they believed I was simply going to give up. Little did they know I was orchestrating their downfall with every move they made. What would you do if someone's arrogance became the perfect trap for your justice? The story begins with a shocking discovery. A boundary crossed, a right violated, or a promise broken. The protagonist stands at their window, on their property, or in their office, and witnesses the first physical signs of encroachment. Perhaps it's machinery moving onto their land, an unexpected letter claiming ownership of something that isn't for sale, or an announcement about plans for something that rightfully belongs to the protagonist. This moment of discovery comes with disbelief and a surge of indignation that something so brazen could be happening in plain sight. The violation is often preceded by warning signs that initially seemed insignificant. A series of escalating letters or messages, each more demanding than the last. First comes the friendly suggestion, then the firm request, followed by veiled threats, and finally, the outright claim or action. The protagonist may have dismissed the early communications, unable to believe anyone would actually follow through on such outlandish demands or threats. This initial underestimation of the antagonist's determination creates the space for the violation to occur. The moment of confrontation follows quickly. The protagonist approaches the antagonist, perhaps a corporate executive, an HOA president, a wealthy developer, or a corrupt official who displays a practiced confidence. When challenged about their actions, the antagonist dismisses concerns with a calculated smile and condescending explanation. They produce seemingly official documents with signatures the protagonist doesn't recognize, reference meetings the protagonist wasn't invited to, or cite regulations the protagonist has never heard of. The explanation comes with an air of inevitability, as if the outcome has already been decided and the protagonist's objections are merely a formality to be patiently tolerated. This first confrontation reveals the antagonist's character, their dismissive attitude, their assumption that power equals right, and their confidence that the protagonist lacks the resources or knowledge to mount an effective challenge. The antagonist often attempts to reframe their violation as a benefit. This will be good for everyone, they insist, or property values will increase, or we're simply enforcing rules everyone agreed to. This gaslighting approach is meant to make the protagonist doubt the legitimacy of their own objections. The stakes become clear during this initial phase. The protagonist realizes this isn't just about the immediate violation, it's about something deeper and more meaningful. Perhaps it's family legacy, as the land or property has been passed down through generations. Maybe it's about community well-being, as the antagonist's plans will harm neighbors or vulnerable people. Or it could be about justice itself, as the antagonist has been bullying others for years without consequence. The protagonist sees that what's being threatened goes beyond material value. It strikes at identity, history, and principles. As the protagonist retreats to process what's happening, they experience a pivotal moment of clarity. This violation is deliberate, calculated, and likely part of a pattern. A phone call or visit from an ally, perhaps an old friend in the records office, a sympathetic insider, or a neighbor who's witnessed similar behavior, confirms suspicions and provides critical information. They've done this before, the ally reveals, or the documents they showed you have been altered, or they're moving faster than they should be able to. This confirmation transforms the protagonist's emotional response from shocked indignation to strategic resolve. The protagonist begins to gather information methodically, searching through old records, contacting officials, reviewing legal documents. Each discovery reveals the extent of the antagonist's overreach and the questionable methods they're employing. As day turns to evening, the protagonist sits amid growing piles of documentation, the reality of the situation sinking in. A knock at the door brings another ally, someone else affected by the antagonist's actions who offers both warning and solidarity. "They told everyone you've already agreed to this," the ally whispers, looking over their shoulder in fear of being seen. This revelation crystallizes the understanding that the antagonist isn't just taking advantage of the protagonist. They're actively lying to others to facilitate their plans. The first part closes with the protagonist at a crossroads, facing a crucial decision: fight immediately and directly, or wait and watch strategically. As they walk their property line, or the boundaries of what's being threatened, examining the markers of the antagonist's intended takeover, the seed of a more cunning approach takes root. Perhaps the antagonist's confidence, their greatest strength, could become their greatest vulnerability. The morning after the initial confrontation, the protagonist sits at their kitchen table surrounded by paperwork, property deeds, bylaws, local regulations, and historical records. Coffee grows cold as they meticulously review everything, searching for the legal foundation to fight back. A family member or close friend enters, concerned about their intense focus and the dark circles under their eyes from a sleepless night. "You need to stop them immediately," the concerned voice suggests, not yet understanding that a more calculated approach is forming in the protagonist's mind. The protagonist makes a crucial appointment with an attorney, a trusted official, or an expert in the relevant field. Documents in hand, they present their case, laying out the antagonist's claims and actions. The professional's reaction confirms the protagonist's suspicions. "They're overreaching badly," they say, examining the papers with growing concern. "This isn't just a simple dispute. This looks like deliberate misrepresentation, possibly fraud." The validation of the protagonist's concerns brings both relief and determination. The meeting reveals more than just legal options. The professional shares that the protagonist isn't the first to face such tactics from this antagonist. "The Rodriguez family faced similar claims last year," they might say, "or 3 other property owners have consulted me about this same group." This pattern indicates that the antagonist has been systematically targeting those they perceive as vulnerable or unlikely to mount effective resistance. The protagonist begins to see their personal struggle as part of a larger issue affecting the community. When the professional outlines standard courses of action, immediate injunctions, cease and desist orders, emergency hearings, the protagonist hesitates. A strategic insight begins to form. What if immediate action isn't the most effective response? What happens if I let them continue temporarily? The protagonist asks, surprising the professional. The question leads to a crucial discussion about the potential advantages of allowing the antagonist to deepen their investment in their mistake. Every dollar spent, every resource committed, every public claim made increases what the antagonist stands to lose. Back home, the protagonist begins transforming a space, a dining room, a spare bedroom, a basement, into an operations center. Maps go up on walls, timelines are constructed, and files are organized. Research into the antagonist reveals telling information. Previous failed ventures, lawsuits settled quietly, connections to officials who approved their projects. The protagonist discovers the antagonist's business isn't just bending rules with them. It's their entire operational model. A series of calls and quiet meetings brings together others affected by the antagonist. An elderly neighbor who can't afford legal fees to fight citations, a local business owner pressured to sell, a former employee with inside knowledge. Each person shares their experience, contributing pieces to a larger puzzle of corruption and intimidation. The protagonist listens carefully, documenting everything, understanding that these testimonies will eventually form a powerful collective case. The protagonist develops a systematic monitoring plan. Cameras are positioned strategically, schedules are created for documenting the antagonist's activities, and a secure system is established for backing up and timestamping all evidence. Technical tools become weapons in this unconventional battle. Long-range lenses for photographs, weather-resistant recorders, motion-activated cameras. As the protagonist outlines their strategy to their closest ally, doubts emerge. Isn't this risky? What if they establish a presence that's harder to remove? The protagonist acknowledges the risk, but explains the calculated nature of their patience. I'm not doing nothing. I'm letting them create the evidence we need. There's a difference between waiting and preparing. This conversation crystallizes the protagonist's approach, strategic patience rather than immediate confrontation. The protagonist makes one more crucial discovery during this phase: the antagonist's true end goal. Behind the public-facing justifications lies a private agenda that's far more self-serving than claimed. Perhaps it's a family connection who will profit from the project, a pre-arranged deal with another entity, or a plan to use the acquisition as leverage for something more valuable. This hidden motivation explains the antagonist's unusual determination and their willingness to cross ethical and legal lines. The information-gathering phase concludes with a quiet moment of resolve. Looking out over what they stand to lose, the protagonist makes a firm decision. They will allow the antagonist to proceed temporarily, not out of weakness, but as part of a calculated strategy to ensure complete and permanent justice. Let them build their own trap, the protagonist thinks, watching the first equipment move into position, camera already recording every movement. The protagonist stands at their window, coffee mug in hand, watching as the antagonist's operation begins in earnest. Workers in uniforms or hard hats move with purpose, machinery rumbles, and the physical manifestation of the violation takes shape. Rather than rushing out to confront them, the protagonist methodically documents everything. The time work begins each day, the company names on vehicles, the faces of supervisors giving orders. Each photograph, video, and note becomes another piece of evidence in the growing case. Days pass, with surprising calm. The antagonist, expecting resistance, appears confused by the protagonist's apparent acceptance of defeat. When they drive by slowly, hoping to gauge the protagonist's reaction, they're met with a casual wave or neutral expression. This strategic facade of surrender is the first element of the trap, creating a false sense of security that encourages the antagonist to proceed boldly and without caution. Meanwhile, the protagonist's documentation becomes increasingly sophisticated. Times, dates, and GPS coordinates accompany each piece of evidence. Expenses incurred by the antagonist are tracked and calculated. Environmental impacts are measured and recorded. The protagonist creates a detailed chronology of every communication, every action, and every violation, building an airtight case that will eventually become overwhelming in its thoroughness. Behind the scenes, allies continue to provide crucial information. An insider shares internal communications revealing the antagonist's true intentions. A sympathetic official forwards copies of suspicious permit applications. A former colleague of the antagonist warns of accelerated timelines meant to establish facts on the ground before any legal challenge can be mounted. The protagonist absorbs all of this intelligence, adjusting their strategy accordingly, always remaining one step ahead. As the violation progresses, the protagonist faces growing skepticism from those closest to them. You're just letting them take what's yours, a family member argues, frustration evident. Every day makes it harder to undo. The protagonist must carefully explain their strategy without revealing too much, knowing that loose words might find their way back to the antagonist. Sometimes, they explain quietly, you have to give someone enough rope to hang themselves. Each milestone in the antagonist project represents a deepening investment and a more serious violation. The clearing of land, the pouring of foundations, the erection of structures, each step increases both the financial commitment and the legal liability. The protagonist watches as delivery trucks bring expensive materials, as specialized contractors arrive for custom work, as the antagonist's vision takes physical form at tremendous cost. All the while, the evidence mounts. The antagonist's confidence grows alongside their investment. A chance encounter brings them face to face with the protagonist, who maintains their calm facade. I see you've had time to review the situation, the antagonist says, voice dripping with false concern. The protagonist responds with calculated ambiguity, neither conceding nor challenging directly. This conversation becomes another test of nerve, as the protagonist reveals nothing of their true strategy, while gathering yet more evidence of the antagonist's intentions. During this encounter, the protagonist makes a seemingly casual inquiry about a name or entity they've noticed on delivery slips or work orders. The antagonist's momentary flash of surprise and hasty explanation confirms a suspicion. There's something hidden about the project's true ownership or purpose. This small revelation becomes another crucial thread to pull later. As weeks pass, the violations begin to affect others beyond the protagonist. Environmental damage spreads to neighboring properties. Noise and disruption impact the community. The antagonist's operation starts to inconvenience or harm people previously uninvolved in the dispute. These impacts create new witnesses and potential allies, people who might have remained neutral but now have personal reasons to support the protagonist's eventual case. The protagonist experiences moments of doubt during long nights, watching the violation progress through security cameras. The emotional toll of witnessing something precious being damaged or taken is significant. Yet these moments of vulnerability are always followed by renewed determination, as the protagonist reviews the growing mountain of evidence and recognizes that their patience is building toward an inevitable moment of justice. A critical juncture arrives when the antagonist, growing ever more confident, begins to violate not just the protagonist's rights, but obvious laws or regulations. Perhaps they work during prohibited hours, ignore environmental protections, or breach safety standards. These clear violations of established rules provide the protagonist with their strongest evidence yet, transgressions that cannot be explained away through technicalities or creative interpretation. The trap is nearly set, with the antagonist now fully committed to their course and blind to the consequences gathering around them. The protagonist's phone vibrates with a text message from their attorney or key ally. Meeting confirmed. 2 p.m. Tomorrow, officials will be present. After weeks or months of strategic patience, the moment to spring the trap has arrived. The protagonist spends the evening organizing their evidence into a compelling presentation. Chronological timelines, financial calculations of damages, video compilations showing the progression of violations, and testimonies from affected Community members. Each element has been meticulously prepared for maximum impact. Dawn brings a surge of activity at the violation site. The antagonist, perhaps sensing something in the wind or simply eager to establish more facts on the ground, has accelerated their work. Extra crews arrive, equipment operates at full capacity, and supervisors bark urgent instructions. The protagonist documents this final push, recognizing it as the last pieces of evidence before the confrontation. At the appointed hour, the protagonist enters the meeting venue, perhaps a government building, hearing room, or community center. The space feels charged with tension. Officials in formal attire review documents at the front table. The antagonist and their representatives sit confidently, unaware of what's about to unfold. Community members, some allied with the protagonist, and others simply curious, fill the remaining seats. The protagonist takes their place, calm despite the pounding of their heart, their attorney or ally beside them with briefcases full of evidence. The meeting begins with formalities, introductions, procedures, the official framing of the dispute. The presiding official, perhaps a commissioner, judge, or committee chair, establishes the purpose to address concerns about the project that has been progressing on contested property or in violation of regulations. The antagonist is invited to speak first, a procedural advantage they accept eagerly. The antagonist's presentation exudes confidence bordering on arrogance. They display polished renderings of their project, cite economic benefits and community improvements, and dismiss the protagonist's concerns as misunderstandings or obstructionism. Their explanation references documents, approvals, and precedents that seem on the surface to legitimize their actions. They conclude with an air of finality, certain they've established their case beyond question. When the protagonist's turn comes, the room shifts imperceptibly. Instead of emotional appeals or general objections, the protagonist begins with specific, irrefutable facts. The document being referenced by the antagonist contains signatures from a meeting that never occurred, they might say, or the permit application contains materially false information about ownership and intended use. Each claim is immediately supported by concrete evidence, original documents contradicting the antagonist's versions, witness statements, official records obtained through proper channels. The presentation continues methodically, building an overwhelming case. The protagonist reveals the true ownership structures hidden behind shell companies. They present time-stamped photographs showing work conducted outside permitted hours or beyond approved boundaries. They play recordings of the antagonist making statements that directly contradict their public claims. Financial records reveal misappropriated funds or conflicts of interest. Environmental impact studies demonstrate damage that exceeds any possible permit allowances. As the evidence mounts, the antagonist's demeanor changes visibly. Initial dismissiveness gives way to concern, then alarm, then barely controlled panic. They whisper urgently to their attorney, shuffle through papers searching for counter-arguments, and interrupt with increasingly desperate objections. The officials, initially neutral or even skeptical of the protagonist's claims, begin to show signs of shock and growing conviction. Heads nod, notes are taken vigorously, and side conversations between officials suggest the seriousness with which they're taking the revelations. The protagonist delivers their most damaging evidence last, proof that the antagonist's project isn't what they claimed publicly, Perhaps it's architectural plans showing private profit centers instead of community benefits, or financial projections revealing how investor funds were being channeled to the antagonist's personal ventures, or communications discussing how to circumvent regulations once the project was completed. This final revelation speaks to the antagonist's true motivations and destroys any remaining pretense of legitimacy. The presiding official calls for a brief recess to review the evidence. During this interlude, the room buzzes with conversation. Community members who came as neutral observers now approach the protagonist with supporting information or expressions of solidarity. Media representatives who might be present request interviews or additional documentation. The antagonist huddles with their team, faces grim, occasionally casting venomous glances toward the protagonist. When the meeting reconvenes, the official delivers their initial determination. While final judgments may require additional process, immediate actions are warranted. A stop work order is issued. An investigation is initiated. The antagonist's permits are suspended pending review. Each pronouncement lands like a hammer blow on the antagonist's plans. The physical manifestation of justice beginning to take shape after weeks of patient preparation. As the meeting concludes, the antagonist makes a desperate final attempt to salvage their position. They might offer a compromise, suggest a partnership, or even attempt to publicly shame the protagonist for blocking progress or community benefits. This last-ditch effort falls flat against the mountain of evidence, and the now shifted perception of everyone present. What once might have seemed reasonable now appears as another manipulation attempt by someone whose credibility has been shattered. Outside the meeting venue, in a parking lot or corridor, the antagonist confronts the protagonist directly. Their public mask of professionalism finally dropping completely. "You have no idea what you've done," they might hiss, or "this isn't over," or perhaps, most tellingly, "we could have made this worth your while." This moment of raw anger reveals the antagonist's true character and confirms that the protagonist's strategic patience was justified. The confrontation often ends with a threat, one that the protagonist calmly records or ensures is witnessed, adding one final piece of evidence to their case. As the antagonist storms away, the protagonist experiences their first moment of genuine relief and vindication. The trap has been sprung successfully. The antagonist's confidence has transformed into their vulnerability, their investment into their liability, their public claims into evidence of their deception. What began as a violation of the protagonist's rights has become the foundation for the antagonist's downfall. The morning after the confrontation, the protagonist stands at the edge of the contested space, property, land, facility, or community resource, observing the sudden stillness where just yesterday there had been frantic activity. Official notices are posted prominently. Stop work order, permit suspended, property in dispute. Workers have vanished, equipment sits idle, and an air of abandonment pervades what was meant to be the antagonist's triumph. This visual confirmation of the initial victory brings a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction, vindication, but also a sobering awareness that the battle isn't fully concluded. The protagonist's phone begins ringing consistently as news of the confrontation spreads throughout the community. Neighbors who had maintained cautious neutrality now express support and share their own experiences with the antagonist. Media outlets request interviews, eager to cover the David versus Goliath. Narrative. Local officials seek additional information for their investigations. Each conversation reinforces what the protagonist has suspected all along. The antagonist's actions had affected far more people than initially apparent, and the stand taken by one individual has created space for many others to seek justice. Meanwhile, the antagonist launches desperate countermeasures. Legal threats arrive by certified mail, demands for damages, allegations of defamation, claims of irreparable harm to business interests. The local newspaper publishes a letter from the antagonist, painting themselves as community benefactors unfairly targeted by an obstructionist. Rumors circulate that they're meeting with higher officials, attempting to override local decisions through political connections. These frantic maneuvers, once intimidating, now appear transparent and ineffective against the solid foundation of evidence the protagonist has established. 2 weeks after the initial stop work order, a formal hearing convenes to determine the final disposition of the dispute. The setting is more formal than the previous confrontation, perhaps a courtroom, council chamber, or regulatory commission hearing room. The protagonist arrives prepared for a grueling procedural battle, but is surprised to find the antagonist's team diminished. Where previously there had been a confident array of attorneys and executives, now sits a subdued group, their ranks thinned by defections and strategic distancing. Some who had hitched their wagons to the antagonist's star have clearly begun to recognize the risks to their own reputations and careers. The proceedings reveal the widening consequences of the exposure. Regulatory bodies have opened investigations into other projects by the antagonist. Financial backers have initiated audits or withdrawn support altogether. Former allies have provided additional evidence of questionable practices in exchange for leniency. What began as a dispute over a single violation has expanded into a comprehensive examination of the antagonist's entire operation, revealing systemic abuses and a pattern of corruption that can no longer be ignored or contained. After presentations of final evidence and arguments, the governing authority issues their determination. The ruling vindicates the protagonist comprehensively. The antagonist's actions are found to be improper, their claims illegitimate, their methods unacceptable. The stop work order becomes permanent. Permits are revoked rather than merely suspended. Fines and penalties are assessed for violations, their substantial amounts reflecting both the severity of the infractions and the deliberate nature of the misconduct. Beyond these immediate consequences, the ruling establishes broader protections. Perhaps a precedent is set that will make similar violations more difficult in the future. New oversight mechanisms are implemented to prevent the circumvention of regulations. Independent reviews are ordered for other projects connected to the antagonist or their associates. The protagonist's strategic patience has yielded not just personal justice, but systemic reform that will benefit the entire community. The most significant aspect of the ruling concerns the disposition of what the antagonist built during their period of violation. Rather than simple removal or restoration to previous conditions, an unexpected transformation is ordered. The half-completed project, be it a building, facility, or development, is to be repurposed for community benefit. What was meant to serve the antagonist's private interests will instead fulfill a public need. The protagonist, as the wronged party, is given substantial input into determining this new purpose, a powerful form of restorative justice that goes beyond mere compensation. In the weeks that follow, the protagonist leads a collaborative process to reimagine the space. Community meetings are held to gather input. Experts are consulted regarding sustainable alternatives. What emerges is a vision far different from the antagonist's plans, one that preserves rather than exploits, serves rather than extracts, and builds community rather than dividing it. The physical structure that was meant to be a monument to greed begins its transformation into something beneficial and accessible to all. 6 months later, on a bright morning, the protagonist stands among a gathering of community members for the official dedication of the transformed space. Perhaps it's now a community center where there was to be an exclusive club, a nature preserve where there was to be a commercial development, or affordable housing where luxury condominiums had been planned. Children play in areas once cordoned off by private security. Neighbors gather in spaces previously designed to exclude them. The protagonist's name may be on a modest plaque recognizing their role. But more satisfying is the simple reality of what has been created from what was nearly stolen. As the ceremony concludes, an elder community member approaches the protagonist. "You could have just stopped them and been done with it," they observe. "Instead, you created something that will benefit generations." This comment crystallizes the profound insight at the heart of the protagonist's approach. Strategic patience yielded an outcome far superior to what immediate confrontation might have achieved. By allowing the antagonist to build before exposing their violations, the protagonist enabled a transformation that would otherwise have been impossible. The final irony becomes clear in a chance encounter months later. The protagonist glimpses the antagonist viewing the transformed space from a distance, their expression a complex mixture of bitterness and bewilderment. They had invested enormous resources in creating something that would serve their interests and exclude others. Now, they must pass daily by a living monument to their failure, a space that embodies exactly the community values they had attempted to override. The antagonist catches the protagonist's eye briefly before turning away, unable to face the physical manifestation of justice that their own actions helped create. The protagonist's home, once a war room filled with evidence and strategy documents, has returned to normalcy. But subtle changes remain, new friendships forged in the heat of the conflict, a deeper connection to the community that rallied in support, a quiet confidence born from standing firm against intimidation. The protagonist has gained something beyond the victory itself, the knowledge that strategic patience can be more powerful than impulsive resistance, that documentation can be more effective than confrontation, and that sometimes the greatest victory lies not in stopping an injustice, but in transforming it into something just. Years pass, and the transformed space becomes so integrated into community life that newer residents have no memory of the conflict that created it. Children who play there, elders who gather there, and families who benefit from it know nothing of the antagonist who inadvertently made it possible. This anonymity of the antagonist's role represents the final completion of justice. Their attempt to impose their name and vision on the community has instead resulted in their erasure from its narrative. The protagonist occasionally visits the space, sitting quietly on a bench or walking its grounds, taking private satisfaction in what strategic patience accomplished. The land, building, or resource that the antagonist coveted has become something more valuable than they ever imagined. serving purposes they never intended. In allowing the antagonist to build their own trap, the protagonist facilitated not just a personal victory, but a community transformation. The violation became the foundation for something better than what existed before, a legacy of justice that will outlast both antagonist and protagonist, standing as silent testimony to the power of strategic patience and the possibility that even the most self-serving actions can be redirected toward the common good. 5 years have passed since the transformation of the contested space. What was once the site of bitter conflict has become an integral part of community life. Children who were toddlers during the dispute now play freely in areas once marked. With no trespassing signs, elderly residents gather in gardens where bulldozers once threatened destruction, and families from all walks of life enjoy amenities that would have been inaccessible under the antagonist's original plans. The protagonist, now recognized with quiet respect rather than fanfare, has settled into a new phase of life marked by the subtle but profound changes that followed their victory. On the anniversary of the dedication ceremony, the protagonist receives an unexpected invitation. A neighboring community facing a situation eerily similar to the one the protagonist navigated years ago has requested guidance. Another powerful entity with familiar tactics, forged documents, misleading statements, intimidation of vulnerable residents has begun encroaching on protected spaces or rights. The invitation comes not from one individual, but from a coalition of residents who have studied the protagonist's approach and recognized its potential application to their own circumstances. The protagonist agrees to share their experience, arriving at a community center filled beyond capacity with concerned citizens. As they describe the strategy of strategic patience and systematic documentation, faces in the audience transition from anxiety to understanding, and finally to determination. "You mean we don't have to stop them immediately?" asks an elderly woman near the front. "Not stopping them immediately might actually be more effective," the protagonist confirms, explaining how allowing violations to accumulate while meticulously documenting each one created an insurmountable body of evidence. This consultation marks the beginning of what becomes an informal movement. The protagonist never sought the role of mentor or advisor, but increasingly finds themselves invited to share their methodology with other communities, organizations, and individuals facing similar power imbalances. A pattern emerges in these conversations. Those facing intimidation initially believe their only options are immediate confrontation or surrender. The protagonist offers a third path, strategic patience coupled with meticulous preparation, that transforms apparent weakness into strength. Meanwhile, the antagonist's trajectory following their defeat reveals the far-reaching consequences of their exposed actions. Initial attempts to dismiss the outcome as a minor setback gave way to cascading repercussions. Investors who lost money in the failed project filed lawsuits. Regulatory investigations expanded to other ventures. Political allies, sensing a liability rather than an asset, distanced themselves. The antagonist business empire, built on practices similar to those exposed by the protagonist, began to crumble under heightened scrutiny. The protagonist learns of these developments not through any personal monitoring, but through occasional news reports and community conversations. There is no vindictive satisfaction in this knowledge, only a sober recognition that accountability, once established, creates its own momentum. Systems that had long accommodated or overlooked the antagonist's methods now found such accommodation. Untenable once those methods were fully exposed. The protagonist had removed one stone from a wall of impunity, and the resulting breach allowed previously contained pressures to emerge. A journalist contacts the protagonist requesting an in-depth interview for a book examining how individual actions can create systemic change. During their conversation, the journalist shares research revealing that the antagonist's operation had victimized dozens of communities over decades. Before your stand, they seemed untouchable, the journalist explains. Their political connections, financial resources and legal team had created an aura of invincibility. Other victims simply gave up, believing resistance was futile. This broader perspective helps the protagonist understand why their victory resonated so widely. It wasn't merely about one piece of land, one building, or one community resource. It was about challenging a pervasive narrative that power always prevails over principle. The strategic patience that seemed so personally difficult during those months of watching violations unfold had demonstrated a replicable method for confronting seemingly untouchable adversaries. The documentation that filled the protagonist's dining room had become a template for others to follow.